Hello Greenstylers, Cynthia here, and today I am going to walk you through the steps of making your very own 3R, that is run, rest, and repeat shorts. So grab your pattern and supplies and let's get sewing. To make your 3R shorts, you'll need the following pieces. 2 front pieces cut mirror images of each other, and these pieces are labeled H1. Make sure to get the notches and the X's marked on your pieces. These are very important. This part that I'm pointing at is actually the top of the piece. I have them laid out sideways on the table, so don't be confused by that. You'll also need 2 back pieces, also cut as mirror images, and these pieces are labeled H2. The back pieces have notches and X marks that are very important for you to transfer as well. You'll also need a waistband piece labeled C1. Make sure to transfer the notches and the circle marking as well. These will be very important when you attach the waistband to the shorts. You can either cut 2 waistband pieces as I've done here as mirror images, or cut on the fold. Be sure to use the appropriate fold or cut line based on your choice of waistband. If making the optional briefs, you'll need 1 front piece cut on the fold, and this piece is labeled H3. For the optional briefs, you'll also need 1 back piece cut on the fold, and this piece is labeled H4. If you've chosen to make the optional bike shorts, you'll need 2 front pieces cut as mirrored images, and these pieces are labeled H5. Be sure to mark the single notch on the long side, not shown here. For the bike shorts option, you'll also need 2 back pieces labeled H6, and these are cut as mirrored images as well. Make sure to get those notches marked. I didn't cut mine out, but I marked them on the wrong side of the fabric with markers. If using the gusset option, you'll need 2 of these small triangular gusset pieces cut mirrored images, and make sure you cut those back pieces on the gusset line if you're using the gusset. You'll need side panel pieces, which include 2 of the side panel piece labeled H7. This is going to be the main side panel piece. And you'll also need 2 of the side panel pocket pieces labeled H8. These are both to be cut as mirrored images, and they both have notches that need to be transferred to your fabric. We'll begin the optional briefs by neatening up the bottom edge of this back piece with a zigzag stitch or serger stitch. You could leave this edge raw. It's the part of the liner that is unattached on the inside of your briefs. You also want to make sure you've drawn the guideline from your pattern piece onto that back piece. Once you have that guideline drawn, which is hard to see on mine, it's a purple line, take this front piece and lay it on top of your back piece with right sides facing each other. You're going to lay the bottom of that back piece right on top of the line, so it's just like sitting right above that line. Pin it in place, and then we're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch from the bottom of that piece. You'll want to use a stretch stitch such as a zigzag, lightning bolt, or triple straight. I'll be using the triple straight stitch on this step, but any of those is fine. Line up your pieces just like so. You're going to be stitching 3/8 of an inch above the bottom edge of that front piece. You may notice on my videos that I'm always grasping that loose thread tail as I start a stitch. This helps to ensure that the fabric doesn't get eaten up into my machine as I begin a stitch right on the edge. If that's ever happened to you, it is an unpleasant experience. Just grasping that thread and very gently pulling it will help alleviate that problem. So I'm laying my pieces down just the way they were before, with the back piece right side up and the front piece right side down. And you can see that seam that I've just created. Now I'll take the front piece and flip it down so that the seam is now sandwiched in between the back piece and the front piece. smooth it all out, and then we'll have two layers right there in the crotch area. We're going to pin those two layers together after we've smoothed them out. We're going to baste these two layers together. Set your machine to a straight stitch and then make it the longest straight stitch that you can. And here you can see that finished seam that we neatened at the beginning, and everything is basted together, so your briefs are now one large piece. Lay your briefs on the table so the right side is facing up, and then fold half of the briefs up on top of the other half. So I laid them down with right side facing up, and then I'm folding the front piece on top of the back piece and lining up those side seams. We will pin and stitch those side seams now. I'll be using my serger here, and you can also use a sewing machine and any stretch stitch that you choose. I'll be adding some 3/8 inch elastic to the leg openings of those briefs. There is a cut chart located on page 9 of the tutorial, but I do want to stress that you want to make sure the elastic length given on the tutorial is comfortable to you. Elastics really vary in their quality, in the amount of stretch, firm stretch versus loose stretch that they have, so it can make a huge difference which elastic you're using and what your personal preference is for tightness. Check it out by stretching the elastic around your leg. You can do it either before cutting or before applying it to the briefs, and make sure it feels good to you. And then once you've stitched it onto the briefs, check it again before doing the final stitch. We'll take the elastic, form it into a loop, and stitch the ends closed. A zigzag stitch works really well for this step. Divide your loop into quarters and mark with a marker or pins. Divide your leg opening into quarters as well. The side seam will be the first mark. Now match up the quarter points on your elastic with the quarter points on your leg opening. You'll be pinning the elastic to the wrong side of the briefs. The part of the elastic that's overlapped can go with the pin that's down in the crotch area. To begin stitching the elastic to the briefs, you'll use a stretch stitch on your sewing machine. I like to use zigzag for this step, or you can also use your serger. So you will stitch the elastic right along the very edge of the briefs, and you'll be stretching the elastic a little bit in order to attach it to the briefs. After this stitch here is a good opportunity to try on those briefs if you want to test the feel of that elastic around your legs. Once you've attached the elastic one time, you're going to fold it over so that the elastic is now enclosed in between the fabric and you don't see any elastic. fold it over along the entire leg opening, and you'll stitch that in place. If you're a seasoned sewist, of course you don't need to pin it in place, but I like to do that just to make sure that it's folded over nice and tightly over that elastic and that there's no extra fabric up in the fold. A twin needle or cover stitch work great for this step and create a really beautiful finish, but I like a good old zigzag for my underbriefs. And now you have a lovely finished leg opening with elastic that's fully enclosed. Repeat all these elastic steps for your other leg opening. We'll begin the optional bike shorts by attaching the gusset to one of the back pieces. Make sure you cut that back piece along the gusset line to make sure that you have room to add a gusset. You can either baste the edges of the gusset or use some wash away wonder tape like I did. That'll hold it together just like a basting stitch would. Take that gusset piece and place it on your back piece just like so. The narrow part will be pointed up toward the top of the piece and the wider part will be pointed down. The two pieces will be right sides together. A tiny bit of that gusset will be poking off the end when you pin it on. You just want enough gusset to be on there so that there's 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way to the bottom of the back piece. Now we'll stitch that gusset piece onto the back piece using a stretch, stitch, or serger. I'll be using my serger here, and I'll start serging on just about an inch above the gusset piece and then end up stitching 3/8 of an inch seam allowance by the time I get to the gusset piece. And here's what your gusset will look like when it's attached, and here's what it will look like from the outside of your pants. There's that nice clean seam line, and there's the gusset. It's not mentioned in the tutorial, but you can top stitch this seam down right at the gusset there. I like to stitch it down just because of where that seam is located inside my shorts. I like for the seam to be nice and flat there. So the seam will be pointed toward the short and away from the gusset, and you'll be stitching on the side of the seam that is the short side. So you'll be stitching through the back piece and through the seam of the gusset and back piece. Start right exactly at the top of the gusset and then top stitch all the way down. Now lay that back piece on your table with the right side facing up and bring your other back piece over to lay right on top of it. Now you'll line up and pin those two back pieces together right along that crotch seam. The back piece with the gusset now has the gusset as part of its crotch seam. So continue pinning right to the end of that gusset. Point where the back piece transitions to the gusset can be a little bit tricky. What you want to do is make sure that the raw edge of that back piece stays pushed up all the way until you get to the very edge of that gusset. You can even put a tiny little snip in the fabric there at the top of the gusset to make sure it stays folded up. I don't find that necessary. What I like to do is get a straight pin and stick it in the fabric right there at the top of the gusset just to make sure that those raw edges stay together all the way to the edge of that gusset, and then I'll stick a pin over the gusset. Your stitch line will follow 3/8 inches away from the edge, and then when you get to the gusset here, you want it to meet right up against that first gusset stitch line that you did, and that will ensure a nice enclosed seam. You can use your stretch stitch of choice or serger like I am. And again, as you're stitching this gusset piece, make sure to take the full 3/8 inch seam allowance and watch that stitch line to make sure it meets up exactly with the edge of your initial gusset stitch line. Continue all the way along the entire back center seam. At this point, you can top stitch the other side of the gusset just up to that point, or you can even go all the way up to the top of that center back seam. Now we'll make the pockets that get attached to the side panels. We'll begin by folding the top edge of the pockets down 1 inch to make a nice finished edge at the top of our pockets for when we put our hand in our pockets. I have drawn a line 2 inches down from the top and then folded the edge down to that line and ironed it to give a nice crisp edge. It just makes stitching it easier, and it makes a really nice flat finish on the top of your pocket. Stitch that edge down using a stretch stitch, twin needle, or cover stitch. And repeat for your other pocket piece. Match notches to line up your pocket piece with your side panel piece. Pin along the bottom 3 edges, and then we're going to use a basting stitch to temporarily attach these pieces together. Set your machine to a straight stitch and the longest stitch length. Baste along the side, bottom, and other side of your pocket insert piece, and try to stay within the seam allowance if you can. If you come out of the seam allowance, you'll just have to pick out those stitches later to make your piece look nice and neat. Complete all of these side panel and pocket steps with the other side panel and side panel pocket piece. Take your back piece and lay it right side up on your table, and you can see there the gusset and then the 2 long side seams. Take one of your pocket pieces and line up the double notched side of the pocket piece. You can tell because it's the side that points upward. You're going to line up that edge right sides together with one of the edges of your back piece. Pin all along that edge. Then take your other side panel pocket piece, match up the double notches, and pin it to the other side of your back piece. We'll stitch these 2 long edges using our serger or stretch stitch on a sewing machine and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Our shorts seem really wide right now, but guess what? They're going to get even wider. We're going to grab our 2 front pieces and attach those to the other side of our side panel pieces. Take your first front piece, find that single notch, and line it up right sides together, matching notches with one of the sides of your side panel. Pin in place and then attach your other front piece to the opposite side, matching notches. Now we'll stitch these two long seams using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance once again. Isn't this fun? You have this really long bike shorts piece now. What we need to do is fold it with right sides together right along the front crotch seam. So you're going to fold the whole thing in half, pin right along that front crotch seam, and then we're going to stitch it using a stretch stitch or serger. Now you see the front crotch on the right and the back crotch on the left. So we'll open up the shorts so that the front center seam is in the front and the back center seam is in the back. And you can already start to see them looking like shorts. We need to pin and stitch along that inseam. Using your stretch stitch of choice and a 3/8 inch seam allowance on this step, I'll be using my serger. When feeding into the serger, make sure your fabric is going in straight. This little notch at the bottom helps with your hem. Straighten and then put it through the serger. Aren't these looking so cute? These are Greenstyle swim fabric, by the way. If you haven't checked out the Greenstyle fabric section of the website, you definitely want to do that. Angie carries the best fabrics for all of your Greenstyle patterns right there in her Greenstyle website. Finally, we'll fold that bottom edge 1 inch up to the wrong side, and you can use that hem knockout angle as your guide. Fold it up all the way around, and then we'll take it over to our hemming machine of choice. You can use a cover stitch, twin needle, or stretch stitch on your sewing machine to hem this bottom edge. Moving on to the main outer shorts, we will take one of our back pieces and one of our front pieces, and we'll line them up at that inner leg seam. We're going to pin right along that short edge and stitch with a stretch stitch or serger, and we'll repeat for the other front and back pair. Once you've stitched the front and back piece at the center inner leg seam, you can open them up and they'll look like this. And here's that seam that we just stitched. Once you've done both of them, lay one of them on the table with right sides up, and then lay the other pair on top of it, and you're going to line them up right along that crotch seam. Make sure that the inner leg seams are matched up and that the front is matched with the other front and the back is matched with the other back. Take this over and stitch along that long curved seam with your stretch stitch or serger. And here is mine completed. Open up the whole thing so that you can match up the top of the back with the top of the front. Now find and match up the X mark on the back piece and the X mark on the front piece. Match them together, making sure that the right side of the front piece is facing outward and that the right side of the back piece is behind the front piece. Pin along that top edge where the front and back piece overlap. It should be just a few inches. Now you need to take this over to your sewing machine and baste those two short sections where the pieces overlap. Here's what your shorts will look like with those two short sections basted. At this point, you can double check that your front piece overlaps on the outside of the back piece on both sides. Now we'll work on the waistband. There are two options for the waistband, a single piece or two pieces. I'll be making the two pieces, as you can see, but I'll be sure to point out the differences if you're making the single piece as I go. So if you're making the single piece, you'll just fold it in half and line up the short edges on one side. If you're doing two pieces like I am, you'll line up the short edges and pin on both sides. We'll take these over to the sewing machine or serger and stitch with a stretch stitch as I've done here. If you're using the two-piece waistband, the circle marks will be the center front and center back seams. The side seams of the waistband will line up with the sides of your shorts. So we'll want to match up the front and center back in order to find the other two quarter points on the side and mark them with pins. If you're using the one-piece waistband, you're going to line up the double and single notches on the waistband with the double and single notches at the top of the shorts. Once you have your shorts marked, you'll just fold the waistband in half with wrong sides together. I've used the sewing machine to stitch the sides of my waistband, so I like to open up those seams before I fold the waistband in half. As I'm folding it in half, I'm just pinning along the quarter points marked on my waistband. If you're doing the two-piece like I am, use the pins on the circle marks. If you're using the one-piece waistband, you already have those notches there, so you can pin wherever you want. Take your waistband and slip it over your shorts and line up all of the points that I just mentioned. So I'll be lining up the circle points with the front and back seam line, and I'll be lining up the side seam of my waistband with the pins on the side of my shorts. And we'll take it over to our sewing machine or serger and stitch the waistband to the shorts. Start stitching near the back center of your shorts, keeping in mind that you're going to leave a 2 to 3 inch opening. I recommend using the sewing machine at this step, as you will be using and stitching over this seam again later in the process. You won't be stretching either the waistband or the shorts as you attach. They should line up perfectly at a 1-to-1 ratio. Leave a 2-inch opening for the smaller size elastic waistbands and leave a 3-inch opening for the larger size elastics. If you're making the single piece waistband version, I suggest that you line up the center front and back and find the side seam points on your waistband. Mark them in the seam or on the wrong side so that you can find that spot later on. Now open up the waistband at the 2-inch or 3-inch opening that you left. Use a safety pin or your favorite turning tool to thread the elastic all the way through the waistband. This can be a challenge for the wider waistbands, but be patient. Take your time and try your best to keep the elastic upright and not twisted. Once you reach the other end, pull the other end of the elastic out, overlap the two ends, and pin them together for stitching. Then you can stretch out the fabric and double check that your elastic is all straight and not twisted in any places. While threading my elastic, my seam at the bottom tried to move up a little bit onto the elastic. So here you see me just stretching it out and moving it back to the right spot. If you haven't already, this is a good time to try on the shorts and make sure that waistband elastic is comfortable. It's okay if it's slightly tighter than you want it, because keep in mind that when we stitch the channels over the elastic, it will loosen it just a tad. Once you're satisfied that everything is in good condition, pull out the ends that are overlapped and pinned together and stitch them together using a wide zigzag stitch. I turned the width of my zigzag all the way up to 6.0. At this point, we'll put the elastic back into the waistband, fold the waistband back down, and stitch up that opening that we left. Use the same stitch that you used when you initially attached the waistband. You may be surprised by this next step, so pay close attention. We're back at the table with our shorts and briefs, or undershorts if you're making the undershorts. Find the center front and center back of your briefs. For the bike shorts version, you'll use the front and center back seams to find the side seam points. Then take the shorts and fold the waistband down, exposing the seam that you created when you attached the waistband to the shorts. With the briefs and the outer shorts both right sides out, we're going to slip the outer shorts inside of the briefs, or bike shorts if that's the option that you're making. Line up the center front and center back and pin together. Then line them up at the side seams. If you're using this single piece waistband, you should have marked the side seams earlier after attaching the waistband to the shorts. You'll go around and pin the entire top raw edge of the briefs or bike shorts to the seam of the waistband and outer shorts. Spread out the outer shorts and waistband seam so that it's nice and flat. They should attach pretty evenly, close to a 1-to-1 ratio, but if you have to stretch the briefs or bike shorts, just make sure you do it evenly across the entire piece. Stitching these layers together, you'll be stitching right along or within that seam allowance that you created already. You can use your stretch stitch of choice at this step, but I will point out that I prefer the sewing machine, as this seam will be completely hidden inside of your shorts between two layers of fabric. You won't be able to see the seam at all, so a sewing machine will be nice because it'll finish the seam and it won't add any additional bulk to already multiple layers of fabric. The seam that's attached to the waistband elastic wants to ruffle up as it's being pulled by the elastic tight. All you'll need to do is flatten and stretch it out so that it matches the undershorts or under briefs. The stitch I just made is the stitch closest to the raw edge. I stitched completely within the seam allowance but you could stitch right over the seam allowance. So you would stitch right at the 3/8 inch line, and that would be perfectly fine. Now you'll take the undershorts or briefs and pull them up and into the inside of the shorts. Now that seam is completely hidden. This is what you'll see when you look into your shorts. A seam allowance free connection between your briefs or bike shorts and outer shorts. Nice and smooth. Here's another good look at what our shorts look like so far. It's so exciting at this point. Now we'll add those beautiful channels to the waistband to make it look really sporty and cool. This is a challenging step for both new sewists and seasoned sewists alike, so be gentle on yourself, take your time, and don't worry about some small mistakes. I want to begin with all of the gathers around the elastic spread out as evenly as possible. So I'll put my hands inside of the waistband and stretch it out from multiple directions, and that will spread out all of those gathers nice and evenly. Let's pin those gathers so that they stay put when we begin stitching. This is a 3-inch waistband that you see in front of you. For the 3-inch waistband and also the 4-inch waistband, I'll use 2 rows of straight pins to keep those gathers locked in place. I'll place one straight pin right above the other, and I'll position sets of 2 straight pins every 3 to 4 inches. The more sets of straight pins that you place, the easier it will be when it comes to stitching. Now we'll head over to the sewing machine once again to stitch those channels. And here's a good look at all of my pins. Slightly lengthened straight stitch to stitch your channels. Use a stitch that's similar to what you use for top stitching. Either a 3.0 up to a 4.0 stitch length will work great. I'm doing 3 rows of stitching on my 3-inch waistband. Use as many stitch rows as you like, and figure out exactly how far apart you want yours to be. Mine will be 6/8 or 3/4 of an inch apart from each other. So I'm starting 3/4 of an inch from the top. The key to getting straight stitches is to go very slowly and to stretch out your entire waistband as you sew. You can't stretch just the top portion where you're stitching. You have to stretch the entire thing. Go very slowly, make sure you stretch the fabric evenly, and remove the top row of pins as you go. For my second row of stitches, I'm stitching another 3/4 of an inch away from that first line, which is also 1.5 inches from the edge of my fabric, and I can follow the 1.5 inch mark that's located right on my sewing machine. Again, I'm using both hands to stretch the entire waistband evenly from top to bottom of the waistband. I just like to point out that my back hand is helping to stretch out the waistband, but I'm not pulling the waistband through the sewing machine. The sewing machine is doing the movement for me with the feed dogs, but that back hand is just helping to maintain a nice and even stretch. An even stretch is the key to nice looking gathers on this. For my final row of stitches, I'm eyeballing a stitch line that's exactly between the middle row of stitches and the bottom of the waistband. If you want to guide the top of your waistband, you could put a piece of painter's tape on top of your sewing machine to give you a nice visual guide. This is the most difficult line of stitching because you have so much in that right hand that you're trying to hold firmly. You really need to go slowly and make sure that you're stretching everything evenly. Don't give up at this point. This is the point where you can get lots of wonky sideways gathers on your waistband, but just go slowly and keep them stretched nice and straight, and you'll end up with a lovely waistband like I have. It's not absolutely perfect, but it looks really good. And you did it. Look at these beautiful 3R shorts that you've created. Now I think it's time to take advantage of the second R in the 3R shorts, the rest part. Put them on and go enjoy your job well done. Thanks for joining me. I can't wait to see your 3R shorts. Be sure to post in our Greenstyle Facebook group and across social media using hashtag GS3R Shorts. Happy sewing from all of us at Greenstyle.